Hello and welcome back to another Django tutorial. This tutorial is an introduction to understanding and managing the database migration process. If you are familiar to running the makemigrations and migrate command, but you don't really know exactly what happens when you run these commands and you want to know a little bit more, this tutorial is for you. In this tutorial, I'm going to try and create a picture in your mind to give you an overview of how the make migrations and migrate command works and what exactly happens when you run those commands. Managing data in Django is obviously a very critical task. So I want to take you through from the very beginning what happens when you run that make migrations or migrate command. So we're going to explore the Django database tables when you initially run the migrate and understand where these tables come from to give you an overview of what exactly is happening here. Then we're going to build an application and then run some migrations. And we're going to have a look at the migration files that are created and explore what they are and how they're created and what we can do with them. And then we'll also explore the connection between migrations and the SQL commands to actually apply the commands into the database. Once we've got a grasp of that, we'll go through some of the other basic admin tools and tasks that we can perform. For example, we'll run through unapplying and reapplying migrations. So by the end of this tutorial, you'll have a solid grounding or solid understanding of what happens when you run the make migrations and migrate command. So there's probably absolutely no doubt at all that you've already used the make migrations and migrate command. You've probably already been through the process of, for example, creating a new application, going into your models, setting out your new model, and then running, first of all, make migrations and then migrate. In this tutorial, I want to take you through the process of what happens when you actually run a migration or a migrate of a model, and then have a look at some of the different commands that we can utilize to control and manage that, and also have a look at the data to see what actually happens when we perform these actions. In this tutorial, just for convenience, we are using the SQLite package, and I am using Visual Studio Code, which you can already see here. So one of the tools that can be handy to actually visualize the database data. So go ahead and go into the extensions manager here, and I've typed in SQLite, and there's a few different tools here that we can install to actually visualize the data inside of our database. So I'm just going to use this SQLite package right here. So go ahead and install that. So once that's installed, we can now utilize this to actually see what's inside of our database. So we can see we've got our database here. So we just need to run that. So I think that's a Control Shift and P. And then we're going to type in SQLite or just SQL do. And we're going to select Open Database and then select our database. Here we go. And you can now see at the bottom corner here, we'll just move that up a little bit. We've got some new options. Or maybe I should say we have some more options. So let's go ahead and select SQLite. And now you can see, if you might need to drag this up a little bit on yours, you can now see all the tables that's inside of our database. So it does help sometimes to be able to visualize the data we have in our database. Now, this example here, I'm using a blog application. So you can see I've already migrated the data. So I can go into this database here, use the drop down. I can see all the fields that are associated to this model. So this represents the fields. So if I go back into my blog model, we can see all the different fields and they match up here. And then what I can also do is right click and show the table. So a new box will appear on the right hand side here. And you can see that there's no data inside of this database. Therefore, you cannot see the data that's inside the database. So I wonder if I've just added anything at all in any of the other. I wonder if I've created a user. No. So let's just go ahead and just add a little bit of data so you can quickly see that. So I've gone ahead and added a bit of data into my post here. So I can now right click and show table, and you can now see the data that's inside the database. So I'm going to build a new project now, and we're just going to go through the process of migrating, make migrations. We're going to have a look at the data, what this represents, so you can become familiar with what is actually being created in your Django database here. So we'll go through that too, and then we'll explore some of the different commands and also have a look at something here that you might not be familiar with, but you've seen, when we can have a look at the different migrations that have been created. And every time we migrate or make migrations, a file will be added here, for example, with the different migrations or the changes that we made in the table. So let me just remove all this. So we'll have a look at that in a second. So let's go ahead now and just create a new project. So this is typically where it starts, your Django project. We create a new project here. I've created a project called core. You can see the general files, and we have the manage py file right here. So typically what happens is that we don't have a database to begin with, and then we go ahead and we run the migrate command. So what's going to happen here, you probably maybe done this, but maybe not considered what actually happens. This is the whole idea of this tutorial. So what happens here is we're going to run this migrate. Now behind the scenes, Django has some code ready to add and create a database that's going to include some of the management tables that's needed to run Django. So we're going to run this now, and I'm going to take you through those different tables, what they mean, what they do, to give us a better understanding of what is actually generated when we run the initial migrate command. So I'm going to go ahead and migrate. You're going to see that there's a number of things applied here. Again, you may have skipped this, so we're going to go through this. You can see that we have a database now. So again, I can run the Control-Shift-P and then just type in SQL and then open up the new database. So open database here, choose the database. So now we can go into the Explorer. You can see that our database has been populated with some files. Or should I say tables, sorry. So what you're looking at here is this is the database, db.SQLite, and these are our tables. So I want to try and be a little bit more specific here. So exactly how do these tables come about? How does Django know what to actually create? Well, that answer there lies within our main application package, and go into settings. And you can see here what we have in the installed apps are a number of different applications here essentially. So you may already be familiar with installed apps because, of course, every time you create a new project or new application, you're going to add it here. And of course, you make the model and then you go ahead and migrate. So it's the same situation here in that by default, Django has all these installed apps configured. And what happens is that some of these applications here require us to actually have tables. So for example, to match this up, the auth, for example, the contrib auth, you can see that Django's had to create, when we migrated, some tables here for the authentication. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 6 tables here for that. Similar to the admin here, we've got the admin log, the content types. So we've created a table here for content type, and we've got session, message, and static files as well. So you can see this, how that session lines up. So this is the reason why when we migrate, these tables will appear in our database, in our database. So let's start to begin to understand what these tables are. So the first set of tables here are the auth system here. So Django has a built-in authentication system. So what we can do, and what generally this looks like you can do here, we can create authentication groups, and we have permissions. So we have authenticated users and we have groups. So obviously what we have in Django is a way of creating authenticated users, for example, the super user. So when we create a super user, you'll probably notice that the user will appear in here. So these are all the fields that are required for a user. So we can go ahead and actually apply that. So let's just type in py manage py and then create a super user. And that will allow us then to create a super user or an admin user for this system. So I'm going to use admin. There we go. So now what I can do is right click, show the table, and you can now see the user I've just made is going to appear here. Let's go ahead. We've got user admin, staff is active, is staff 1, so that's active, is active 1, so that means the user is active and we can log in. So that clearly identifies where that table or what that table is for. So users can be in groups. So we can place this user in a group if we want to. So we can add some groups. We've got user ID and group ID. So this table is for collecting and saving groups. Now, something else that we have here are authentication permissions. So we can apply permissions to users. So essentially what these tables here are for is when we set up permissions for the user, these settings will be configured and applied and saved inside of these tables. Now, by default in Django, when we create a new model or a new table, for example, then there is a default set of privileges that gets applied to that table. Now, if we go into the auth user permissions and then just have a look at this table, I've actually selected the wrong table. This is the table I was looking for. So you can see here in the auth permission, we can see we've got some different code names: add, change, delete, view, add, change, delete, view group, add user, change user, delete user, view user, and so on. So these are all the privileges that's been set up. So sorry, let me just make that clear again. So every time we build a new model, so if we made a new app called blog and then made a new model, every time we make a new model, Django automatically creates some permissions for that model. So generally those permissions include add, change, delete, and view that particular model. So that then allows us in Django to apply these privileges or these permissions to users so that we can configure what users can access what data. That's essentially what's going on there. So you can see that we're storing all that data inside of this table called auth permissions. And if I was to make a new model now, we would see that that model would have the name. So for example, if it was called blog, here it would say add blog, change blog, delete blog, and view blog. So that's what would be added if I created a new model right now. And we're creating a new model later and we actually see that in place. So let's move on. So this kind of gives you the overview now of why these authentication tables are here. So let's move over to the Django admin log. So I've gone ahead and I've created a new user in the admin area. And now I can see by right-clicking and showing the table, it's now been populated by a new entry. So this is essentially what it says, a log of all the actions that's been performed by a Django admin user. So it's fairly interesting if you drill down to the code here, for example, it does give you all the information to identify what's happened here. So the user ID, that's the user ID of the admin, has performed this action. For example, the action flag, number 1. So I think there's 3 actions or action flags that Django has. The first one is addition. So if I've added something new, then it's number 1. And you can see that I've added a new user called new, and that's created object ID 2. So that's created a new user, got the ID of 2. That kind of makes sense there. And you can see it says added here. So action or flag number 2 is change. So if I were to change the username of this user, then here it would say change, for example, in the message, and the action flag will be number 2. And then if I were to delete this user, the action flag would be 3. So there's 3 actions that are going to be performed: 1, 2, and 3, add, change, and delete. So that gives you a general overview of now what this table is. And of course, we could utilize this information because it's important information to determine maybe if your application was infiltrated in some certain way. We could see exactly what happened, the actions that were taken, because they're all stored in the database. So next up, we have the Django content type. So this, if I open up and show the table, you can see it gives me a list of all the apps and then the model that it's associated to. So we have a list of app labels and models, and that can be useful to access certain models and so on. So right-click on the Django migrations, and now I have a list here of all the different migrations actions that have taken place so far in this application. So this is a record of all the migrations that have been applied so far in this application. I've just said that. Apologies, I repeated myself, but that's fairly clear. So if we make a new blog application in a minute and then just make a migration, that's going to be added to the end of this list. So in Django, when we start talking about migrations, it looks as though that we have a way of recording almost like a version control system within Django, where we can control and manage what migrations have taken place. And of course, we have the possibility, and I'll show you how we can roll back migrations. So not only can we build and make migrations, we can roll back. So that can be an important feature that we'll have a look at later in this tutorial. So finally, we have the Django session table. So this is recording all the sessions that are being utilized currently. So for example, I am logged in as the admin user. So Django has created a session for that particular user. Sessions in Django is an optional feature. We can remove it if you go into the settings. Remember, we've got two settings, I think, here. We've got the sessions, and then we've got the middleware here. So we can remove that. We don't have to use sessions in Django, but by default, when we create a new application, it's there and available for us to utilize. So without going into too much detail, sessions are a way of letting us store and retrieve arbitrary data on a per site visitor basis. So the user, when they log in, will create a session on their browser, and data will be sent across the server to their browser, maybe a session key, for example, and store as a cookie, for example, in their browser. And then we can utilize that to authenticate the user, maybe, for example, or send data back or forth, or just to recognize who the user is when they interact with our website. So I've gone ahead and just created a new application here. So manage pi startapp.blog. So I just add that to my commands list here so you can have a look at this yourself. So now I've created a new application. I can go ahead and go into settings and obviously just add my new app here. So I've gone ahead and created a new model here. This is just for demonstration, so you don't need to follow this. So we've got two models here, the category and the post model. So we're concentrating on migration. So let's go ahead now and migrate this data. So I am assuming that you understand what's happening here. We've just created two new tables. Now we need to migrate. So the typical process, like you're probably familiar with, is we're going to run the make migrations. That's the first command that we make. So let's go ahead and do that and see what happens. So what we have now is an overview here of what's been created, or a migration that's been created. So the big question now is, what exactly happens when we run the make migrations command? So if we now go into the blog folder here, we can see there's a couple new folders here. So we've got this cache file here, we've got migrations, we've got another cache folder, and we've got this init file, and we've got the 00 or the 0001 initial file. So generally, when you run a Python program, the interpreter compiles it first into bytecode. So this is generally stored in this PyCache folder. So this is bytecode compiled and optimized to maybe run the program files or to perform some actions. So essentially what these are cache files that's going to speed up the process of particular tasks. As a programmer, you're generally just going to ignore it. Like I said, it can make your program start a little bit faster or run the scripts a little bit faster. So remember, this is just bytecode compiled. This is something that you would git ignore. So it's not something you would back up at all. This is something you can delete. So let's move on to the init file here. So this is just a mandatory file that's going to be required in order for Django to see this folder, essentially, or utilize this folder. You can see it's completely blank. So that's a way of just Django recognizing this folder exists so that we can do something within the folder. And what we're going to do is save these files here, these generated migration files. So let's remember, we've only run the one command, which is make migrations. So all that's happened so far is that that's generated this new file called 0001 initial. It's important to understand that when we run the make migrations command, we don't actually put anything inside the database. We don't actually commit anything. All we're doing is preparing the data to be ready to go into the database. So let's just clarify that, and I'm repeating myself a little bit here. So this migration file, this is a migration file, is Django's way of preparing changes to be made to the to the models, to the database. Now remember, this could be preparing the data to add fields, maybe to delete fields or update fields. So there's a number of tasks that could be performed. Now if we were to try to read this, you can generally read this here. So you can see here that we're going to migrate this new model called category. So we're going to build a new table called category, and that's going to have an ID and a name. So one thing to remember here is that when we create a new model, we don't normally specify the ID of that table. So if we go back into our model that we created, we don't actually specify this unique primary key ID. Django will just add that automatically. And you can see here, if you're familiar with databases, it's going to be the primary key. So that's something that we can configure in the models, but it's out of scope here in this tutorial, but that's good to know and to remember. You can see the second table here. This is going to be a second table called post, and this is going to be the fields that we're going to utilize. So you can see that we've got some ordering in place as well. So that's essentially what's going to happen. We can generally read this file, and now this file is going to be passed over when we run the migrate. This is going to be translated into SQL code, and then that's going to be taken and then run by the database, and then the action is then going to be performed. In this case, we're going to create two new tables. So what I've done in general here is I've actually just told you what the Django's ORM is. So the object relational mapper. So Django has, or one of the most powerful features, considered most powerful features of Django, is the object relational mapper. So the ORM, and this is a popular tool that's utilized by other packages that you might utilize. So this is a way of us being able to interact with our database, but not having to actually write any SQL, for example. So like I said here, we're making this migrations file, we're preparing this file, or Django prepares this file. We've just specified the model. Now this is going to be translated, like I said, into SQL, and then that can then be applied to our database. Now remember, if you're not familiar, SQL is a database language that allows the database to actually construct or actually commit or run a command that's going to change the database in some way. Add, delete, update a table, for example. So we've created this migration file. Let's go ahead now and actually look at the SQL. So what we can do is we can run this command, manage pi, and then we can run the SQL migrate command, and then we identify the actual application, in this case blog, and then the actual file, which is 0001. So I'll give that 0001, and then we'll run this command, and you can now see from this migration the actual SQL that's going to be run. Let me just slim this down a bit. So you can actually see all the SQL that's actually going to be run to actually generate and commit these tables, these new tables, to our SQLite database. So just to be super generalized here, you might utilize this code here to troubleshoot your application or your tables or your data, for example. You might utilize it to make some changes and then recommit to another database or so on. So you can save this, and potentially, because this is SQL, so I say this very lightly again, this could be utilized for creating different tables or databases in a different database software. So I've gone ahead and added that to the commands text here that you can have a look through. So just remember that this is the main command, SQL migrate, the name of the app, and then the name of the actual migration. And that will then generate the SQL for that migration. Another command that we can run that's going to be helpful within the migration process is the manage pi show migrations. So this is going to give us a list of all the migrations that have taken place and the ones that haven't been committed yet. So notice here that if we look up, we've got the X next to these items here for different commits that have been made. So these here represent the initial migrations that we've made on the admin and on the auth. I'm going to say package or application, and you can see we've got content types, etc. But here, for example, we know that we've already made this initial migration using makemigrations, but we haven't actually committed to the database yet. And you can see here it hasn't actually been committed, and therefore there is no X in this box. So that can be helpful for us to track to see what has been committed and what isn't committed. So maybe we can roll back and roll forward when we're trying to manipulate or change or just play with the migrations and the data in the database. Okay, so next up is going to be our migrate command. So we're now actually going to take this migration that's been set up. We realize now that that's going to be translated with the Django ORM into SQL language, and then it's going to be thrown across to the SQL database and then actually applied to a database. So let's just see this in action. So we're going to run the manage migrate. That's then going to apply the operations, so operations to perform. It applies the migrations here. So the blog 001 initial migration, it takes that and it applies it, translates it into SQL, and then puts it into our database. So now when we go into our database, if we refresh here, you can now see we've got 2 new tables. That's what we've asked for. Obviously, there isn't any data in there. Let's have a look at the migrations table, see what updates have been made here. Let's move that across. So at the bottom here, you can see we've got 2 new entries, the session and the blog, referring to the 001 initial migration items. Now let's look into the contents type. So we now have 2 new entries here for blog. So the blog app has a model called category, and the blog app also has a model called post. So that's been updated in the Django content type table. So let's go ahead and just go into our blog here. Let's just move that down. Let's go into the models here. Let's just make a change to this model. So for example, we wanted to change the name of category. No, we wanted to change the name of title to just name. So we wanted to make this change. So we do that. And then obviously we just go ahead and we need to change this down here. So we've made some changes in our table. So now let's just go ahead and make a new migration. With the S. And we seem to have got a problem here. Ordering refers to non-existent field, related field, or table lookup title. So what's happened here is I haven't actually completed everything as I needed to. So let's just go back and have a look what the problem is here. Because I'm adding the ordering to title, I need to change that to name. Okay, so that's what the problem was there. To apologize. So let's just go back and we'll just make a migration again. So did I make the rename? Yes, I did. So I can go ahead and say, yes, I did make that. So it's recognized what changes have been made. And there we go. So now we've got a new migration. So let's go back into our blog and we now have a new file here called 002. And inside of here, this is going to describe what is needed. We can now read this migration. Essentially what's happening here, you can see that the old name is title and the new name is name. So all these commands here are Django commands. And with Django's ORM, this is going to take those commands and then, like I already said, it's going to change that into SQL code. So let's have a look and see the SQL that's going to be applied for this migration. So I run the command again, and this time I'm going to select the second one, 002. So let's go ahead and do that. So I can now see that what's going to happen here is we've just got the alter table command. So blog post, so that's the name of the table that's referred to in the database. And then we're just going to run the rename column. So this is SQL code, a rename column, title to name. And that's all that's going to happen. And then we run the commit to actually commit that to the database. So let's go ahead and actually commit this. I am going somewhere with this. So migrate. So that's migrated. Let's go into the SQL Explorer. Let's go to post, show the table. Show the table. We'll do a refresh. Show the table. I think we've already got open. Nope. I made a mistake then. Obviously, there's nothing in the table. We can see it right here. Apologies. So here it says now name. So clearly we've done a refresh and the name has changed from title to name. So that's the change that we've made. So why was that important? Because I just wanted to show you the fact that we can roll back. So now we've got two migrations. Maybe we're not happy with that migration. Maybe we want to roll back. So we have the ability to actually remove this and go back one. So what we're doing here in Django terminology is we're unapplying migrations. Now, this isn't always going to work. This is a very simple example, and I'm just showing you this is the case that we can unapply migrations. So let's have a look at how to do that. Well, what we can do is we can again run the manage py file, or we can just run the Django admin, and then we can then select the application, in this case blog, and now we can just go ahead and select the migration. So 001, let's run that, and we've forgotten the command migrate, of course. There we go. So there we go. So what it says here is it's rendering model state done, unapplying blog 002 auto. Okay. Okay, so it looks like that might have happened. Now let's just remember in our post here, we had name and varchar. Now, if you remember, originally it wasn't called name. So let's just refresh. And now you can see it's gone back to title, the original name. So there's nothing different there other than we're just selecting the migration that we want to move back to. And we do that by just using the migrate again. And this time just selecting the actual migration we want to move back to. But like I said, there is a caution here. If you've got a large database, complex database, that isn't always going to work. So I wonder now if we can then move back now to the other migration. So let's have a go at doing that. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to run this flag here called plan. So this plan here, it says no plan migration operations. So by utilizing the plan switch here, it will check to see which migrations will be unapplied. So in this case, no migrations will be unapplied because we're just going back, or we're going forward in this case. So this isn't going to be a case that this is going to show anything. So let's just go ahead and check to see if this has worked. So we haven't actually done anything here. So because we've used plan. So let's go ahead and actually now, so we actually run the wrong thing there. We run number 1, not number 2. So let's do this and just show you plan again. So let's migrate to blog 2. Let's do that. So now we refresh the table again. You can now see that's changed to name. So now let's run the plan again on number 001. So what we're going to do now is roll back to the first migration again. Apologies if this doesn't make sense. So now I've used plan. And what that's done there is it actually hasn't done anything. So I refresh, it hasn't actually done anything. But it's actually now telling us whether the migration, the unapplying the migration will be what will actually be done when we unapply the migration. And you can see here it says undo change meta options on post, undo rename field title on post to name. So those are the two changes that are made. So it looks like it's going to be successful. So then we can go ahead and remove the plan and actually then run our migration.